All right. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Centre for European Reform, whether you're here in person or online. I'm Ian Bond, I'm the Deputy Director. Let me start by reminding people that this meeting is on the record, so anything we get wrong can be quoted back at us, and no doubt will be at some point. Where are we? In a few days' time, it'll be 3 years since the Russian Federation launched an unprovoked, full-scale war of aggression against Ukraine. But actually, that wasn't the start of the war. The start of the war was 11 years ago, in February 2014, when little green men appeared in Crimea. But the scale and the savagery of the attack that took place in February 2022 really was something else. It came as a shock not only to Ukraine, but to Europe and to democracies across the world, from Canada to New Zealand. And the initial reaction of the democratic world was to show solidarity with Ukraine, for example, by taking in refugees. But I think in most cases to assume that the war would be over quite quickly and that it would end with a Russian victory. And it soon became clear that the Ukrainians had other ideas. And the more successfully the Ukrainians resisted and defended themselves, the more help they got from the West. But we seem now to have reached a sort of plateau. The Russians retreated from their initial gains over the course of 2022, but in fact not much has changed since then. Russia now occupies about a fifth of Ukraine's territory. It's moved forward a little bit in the last year, but by less than 1% of Ukraine's territory. Still, the last year has been quite difficult. For the most part, the Russians have been moving forward, and Western assistance has not always come as quickly as it should. And now, as we saw yesterday, we have the Trump administration cozying up to Vladimir Putin, offering him continued control of Ukrainian territory that he has captured so far, dropping the idea of NATO membership for Ukraine, promising that there won't be any American troops in Ukraine, and as Marco Rubio said yesterday in Riyadh, suggesting that once the fighting is over, there will be unique and historic economic partnerships between the US and Russia. So at a time when I think that the West should be ratcheting up the pressure on Russia through sanctions, through military assistance, and so on, we're getting rather the opposite. So this seems like a very timely moment to take stock of what's happened, of what's happening now, and what we think might happen, and perhaps in some cases, how we might stop it happening. At this point, I would normally say, and it's a pleasure to be moderating this discussion. It's not a pleasure. It grieves and angers me that 11 years after Russia began this war against Ukraine, we are still having these discussions. But it is at least a privilege to have two such excellent panelists alongside me to discuss this. Iuliia Osmolovska, on my right, is the head of the GLOBSEC Kyiv office. She spent 15 years in the Ukrainian diplomatic service with a particular focus on EU integration and European security, worked for the Office of the President of Ukraine, as well as think tanks and consultancy. General Sir Richard Shirreff, on my left, served in the British Army for almost 40 years. Is that right?
It is.
Crikey, yeah. You look pretty good on it, actually.
It's a picture of Dorian Gray.
Including as the commander of NATO's Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, and finally as Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. He's also the author of 2017 War with Russia, an urgent warning from senior military command, a book which I suspect may be finding some new readers at the moment, and perhaps should have been read more attentively by some of them at the time. But Yulia, let me start with you. I mean, what's the mood in Ukraine 3 years after the full-scale invasion? You know, how do people think things are going, and how are they reacting to what Trump is doing and what he thinks of as a peace plan, even if it's neither a plan nor likely to bring peace?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to be here again. And it's sort of like tradition. You said that it's a tradition that we started to do this kind of assessment of situation since March 2022 together with Richard. So it's my great pleasure to continue in that capacity, and hopefully next year would be a bit different mood for that. When it comes to what's going on in Ukraine, what's the mood of the society, let me start with probably sad joke, because some of social surveys conducted in the end of 2024 in December showed that 51% of Ukrainians still think positive about America and still think that it's going to remain a great country by 2030. And it's already was the fact when Trump was elected as a new president. I think if they would have conducted similar surveys these days, the mood could have been much, much more different. But when it comes to where we are in the society, so definitely first remark that I would like to make right now, with all this fuss about negotiations and the preparedness of Ukrainian society for that, because for Zelensky is going to be the most challenging task probably to sell this to the society. So everybody is looking at how Ukrainian society is prepared for that, whether there is an appetite for this or not. So my first remark is that we have very conflicting data on that. Depending on which source you're using, you will get either positive towards negotiation, even up to the conceding some of the territories. And on the contrary, the other one. Let me give you a couple of examples. So Gallup survey conducted in the end of 2024, they said that 54% of Ukrainians are ready for territorial concession in exchange of peace, and 38 are against this. So definitely they clearly show the trend of increasing the number of those who already ready to concede the territories. And it has been understandable and expected in a way, because definitely the society is very tired. And what Russians are doing, my personal experience, I live in Kyiv, since August, we've been having every night air raids, drone attacks. For those who are living in the region, so Kyiv is more or less fine with that, because they may have like 1 to 2 air raids per night. But for the regions, it's going to be lasting the whole night. 3 to 5 different attacks, all these drones are moving in different directions. So it's basically what it creates this sort of psychological exhaustion for people, and definitely people would be willing to consider at least temporary relief in terms of ceasefire for them to be able to sleep at least properly a couple of nights. But when it comes again to these preferences and data, another survey by Kyiv International Institute of Sociology conducted in September last year provides us completely reverse data. Like 58% of Ukrainians are not ready for any concessions of territory, and only 32% are ready for concessions. Active group survey, November 24, conditions for negotiations, for ceasefire. So in order to conduct something that they would expect from Russians and in talks of this, in these negotiations. So ceasefire as a prerequisite. 30% of Ukrainians want that. Return to the borders of February 2022, 20%. No conditions at all, immediate start of negotiations, 15%, 1.5, so not a big number. Withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian territory and reparations, same number as for those who are not willing to, who are ready to start negotiations and to give up everything, so 15%. In terms of how the society assesses where we are, Lemur Group and New Image Group survey conducted in January 25. 34 Ukrainians consider the developments are getting in the right way, and 42, much more percentage, is considering the developments are going in the wrong way in Ukraine. So markers for victory, how Ukrainian society sees it. Return to the borders of 1991, 48%. Again, this is what I see. The data might be very confusing for you if you will be looking for something whether Ukrainian society is prepared to concede the territories in these negotiations or not. So in generally, again, with reference to this Lemur survey, in favor of negotiations, 56%. But then the trick comes in details. So what you actually imply by negotiations, what would be at stake and what would be trade-off. And then on this, the society is very polarized. Dominating emotions in the society, as it has been discovered by another survey by Grados in January 25. So the leading one is definitely exhaustion, as I said, 52%. Fear of something that might happen, only on 7th place, with 27%. And 53% of Ukrainians believe that Ukraine is capable to defeat Russia. So again, you see all these figures are confusing. So when it comes to economic performance, I won't be bothering you with a lot of data, but let me say to you that we're still managing to run the economy in war times, and they're definitely mostly due to the assistance of our international partners, because if the budget expenditure size in 24 amounted roughly for 80 billion of dollars. So international assistance we received 41 billion, so almost half of it. And the distribution goes the same way, the same logic as we described before. So we try to spend the revenues that Ukraine receives internally for defense and security stuff, and then to support the economy running with the help of international assistance, which is still the case. Economic activity has been reactivated, been revived, has been revived, and right now the unemployment rate is not very big number. It's almost 11%, at least officially, and people are not, 60% of Ukrainians are not considering of leaving the country. This is the data from this Grados research, but I could give you alternative data according to some different measurements of our sociologists, regardless of what might be the negotiated agreement, the terms of that. About 1 million of Ukrainians are ready to move abroad, and we expect to receive back from refugees numbers like 500,000 only. So definitely it's going to be negative migration from the country. Internal politics, you asked me to develop it on that. So the key question right now is, and will be definitely these potential elections in Ukraine, which by all reasonable means, and everybody who is thinking rational understands that it's a nonsense in a war-torn country, because part of Ukrainians moved abroad, part of them internally displaced. We still have the provision that under the martial law we can't conduct any elections. Then what about the guys who are on the front line, how this could be organized? So basically we consider in Ukraine, most of Ukrainians don't want these elections. And secondly, probably because we don't have any meaningful figures that might come up, so it would be very difficult to make this choice, especially in such a limited time frame. And definitely, if we are up to this as part of this Trump requirement, hinted on that, so this should be one of the key blocks of this negotiated solution. So it definitely is playing very well in Russian hands, because it will create a lot of internal turmoil in the society. Again, all these political groups are fighting against each other. Russians are capable of introducing pro-Russian loyal candidates with, if not pro-Russian agenda, because people might be suspectful of that, but saying that this candidate might be coming up with kind of constructive potential elements for this peace settlement that might be viewed as more positive for Ukrainians, and Russians might be hinting that they would be likely to support it. And this is how they could leverage this drift of a lot of Ukrainian people towards a pro-Russian loyal candidate. In terms of political prosecution, or a sort of, you wanted me to comment on recent case on Poroshenko. It's a bit strange case in a way that the decision that was made of the National Security and Defense Council actually contained a couple of technical mistakes. That means that this decision can't be put in force, so it should be rewritten somehow. And some of the political experts tend to consider this, that Zelensky actually offered a room for trade with Poroshenko in a way, like if he's ready to get the money back, some that had been sent abroad since the war started. So Zelensky is ready to review this decision. This actually might have some justification. I won't consider this as a strong political prosecution of Poroshenko. Because if you look at, for instance, Klitschko, he's able to travel, he's able to be in Munich, to come to London to see people. So it's probably a particular case with Poroshenko. And if you compare data of his enrichment, he was ranking the 8th oligarch in a line when the war started. And right now, Poroshenko is number 2 in this list of the most wealthiest people in Ukraine. So this obviously raises questions to him. And we in Ukraine have a lot of a long memory, and we do remember how Poroshenko ruled the country, and all these corruption cases, and all these kind of public movements, or especially of those who were related to the military staff, blaming him for actually making all these corrupt schemes in military production. So this is something we can discuss, but I don't see that this is something which it doesn't have objective justification.
Okay.
So I'll stop here. I left external block entirely, but probably it's for the Q&A.
Okay, we'll come on to that, I'm sure. So, Richard, I mean, let's start with the situation on the battlefield. I mean, how do you assess that? And given what's been going on in the US over the last week or so, how damaging would it be if the US stopped military assistance to Ukraine, and how much of what the Americans are doing could Europe fill in for?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me today. I get my, I mean, it's every year since I was in Ukraine with Iuliia and GLOBSEC, but I get my daily feed, as it were, from open source intelligence like ISW and others. So that's my, that's why I'm hearing what's going on. And my take at the moment is that Russia is really hurting. Yeah, Ukraine is hurting as well. And as Ian said in the introduction, the battlefield, the front line has really hardly moved at all in the last year or so. Yeah, Russia has made gains, but relatively small gains. Ukraine, of course, is still in Kursk, has been counterattacking in Kursk, and everything that Russia is doing is painfully slow and deeply painful to Russia. I mean, on the current trajectory of casualties, Russia will have lost 1 million casualties, killed and wounded, by the time Putin stands up on the podium on the 9th of May in Moscow for his victory parade. Other positive from a Ukrainian perspective developments, the neutralization of the Black Sea Fleet, effectively by a country without a navy. A point I like to make to our naval colleagues in the Ministry of Defense as they approach the Strategic Defense Review. So what we're seeing from Ukraine is real ingenuity. But Ukraine has also got challenges. internal challenges, the organization of the army, the command and control of the army, the manning of that army. So at the moment, I think, frankly, this is the time. And then on top of that, of course, we read constantly about the pressures on the Russian economy, and this might be something for this to pick up in Q&A and discussion. The impression one gets is that it is a seriously leaky ship. There have been panicky efforts to stave off the inevitable. But there are plenty of commentators who say that collapse of the Russian economy is around the corner. So I get a sense that this is a time when it's about who blinks first. And Trump has blinked first. So, and then just another statistic of interest is that the International Institute for Strategic Studies assessed that Russia probably is on the current rate of loss of armored vehicles, has probably got about a year's worth of armored vehicles left, tanks, armored infantry fighting vehicles, APCs and the like. And even those are mainly old Soviet stock. So Russia is really hurting. I listened to the Ukraine Today podcast on the Daily Telegraph podcast, which is pretty good, actually. There's some good stuff there. I mean, their view is that the Russian army is close to breaking. Use of civilian vehicles for logistics, golf buggies, donkeys, they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel. On the innovation side, I mean, Ukraine, I think, has been remarkable and is a real exemplar for the West, particularly. And if you haven't come across it, I really recommend you look at the Brave One website, because, and again, when I was there, we visited with GLOBSEC back in April 2023, just after it had set up, and it's a great organization seeking to bring together, to link up inventors who've been working in their workshops, their garages, around the kitchen table to come up with battle-winning ideas, and to get those battle-winning ideas on the battlefield as quickly as possible. And when I asked Natalia Kushnevska, who is the director, she said about the timescale, she said, well, we're aiming at about 7 weeks. Well, you go and tell that to the procurement people in the Ministry of Defense here or elsewhere in Europe, in Western Europe. But the key metric is not so much that timeline as the time it takes the Russians to develop a countermeasure. So Ukraine has come up with some great stuff: autonomous vehicles, use of artificial intelligence in the kill chain, a whole range of very innovative drones. But Russia is also innovating too. And we should never underestimate Russia. So on the one hand, you've got this sort of lumbering, brutal meat attacks, huge numbers of Russian casualties. But on the other hand, you've got some real innovation in the world of drones, of data transfer of drones and artillery and the like. The impact of American withdrawal of military support, and again, I touched base with Iuliia before we start, and I think I defer to her on this. Massive, absolutely massive. Will Ukraine be able to continue to fight? Well, my take, and again, I've deferred to Iuliia on this, but every time I've had this conversation with her and other Ukrainians, the message I get is that, yeah, we're hurting. Yes, we're tired. Yes, we're suffering massive casualties. But we know that if we stop fighting, we'll cease to exist as a nation. And so we'll either go on fighting with you or without you. So I don't think, and then where does that leave what's going on between Rubio and Lavrov? Frankly, I think it's cloud cuckoo land, because I don't think Ukraine is likely to accept that, any sort of imposed ceasefire. But again, more for discussion later. I mean, I think, this week has laid clear for once and for all something we knew was going to happen when Trump got in. So what was said last week in Munich and what Trump announced should have been absolutely no surprise. And yet it's got Europe running around like headless chickens, frankly. Very clear that they were going to say, where are we? Well, it's very clear now. America is no longer the guarantor for security in Western Europe. America, I think, has abdicated its leadership of the so-called free world, because with leadership comes responsibility, and America is not prepared to shoulder that responsibility. And we Europeans and Canada take a lot of the blame for that because of our freeloading for decades on American largesse as far as defense is concerned. And then you've got the sort of narcissistic grandiosity of Putin's most useful idiot, Trump, which we heard last night. The cause of the war is Ukraine. And essentially what Trump is doing is laying the ground for Putin to achieve his principal foreign policy objectives, the neutralization of NATO, if not the destruction of NATO, the decoupling of America from European security, the annexation of all those bits of Ukraine, the oblasts in the east and the south, which he wants, the removal of Zelensky through elections, and no doubt the arrival of a puppet, which will ensure that Putin gets his aim of reducing Ukraine to effectively a client state like Belarus. And don't forget, one of the conditions that Putin has stated is unequivocally, and they have not rowed back from at all, is the rollback of NATO from Eastern Europe, from Eastern Europe. So those countries which have joined since 2004, 2007, implication a new Yalta. And Putin has always said the most appropriate security settlement for Europe is a new Yalta. So Putin's intent has not gone away. The so what, I think, for the what can be done, and this is absolutely, this is what sort of European reform is all about, really, in this context, is the only way forward, frankly, as far as I can see it, is a united Europe that says, frankly, to Trump, 2 fingers to your peace plan. We are going to support Ukraine unequivocally. We are going to, and Canada's part of this as well, so don't forget them too. We are going to put together a strategy, come what may, however difficult. Yep, we don't want to be where we are, but the only solution is for us to dig deep, to make the sacrifices, to make the mindset shifts necessary, to mobilize our economies, to put them on a war footing, to give Ukraine the means to give Russia such a bloody nose that Putin recognizes that he's never going to get what he wants. The problem for the last 3 years has been that there has been no strategy as far as support for Ukraine from the West is concerned. It's been bilateral support on an ad hoc, incremental basis, drip, 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 hand-wringing about the provision of long-range precision missiles, of tanks, etc., etc. A little, and all that has been too little, too late. It's been enough to stave off defeat, but it has not been enough to give Ukraine the means to achieve victory. So the only solution, and this is about as far-fetched as it gets in the current circumstances, is a united Europe and Canada that says, come what may, we will design a strategy to support Ukraine in the defeat of Russia, because that is the only way that peace is going to be achieved. Now, the challenges of that are immense. And of course, it all starts with defense spending. And at the moment, frankly, the omens are not good, because everybody's been talking about the need for increased defense spending to take this country. But the government is absolutely sticking to 2.5% of GDP on defense when conditions allow. And until and unless there's a change on that, I fear that the omens are not good, and that the Americans will continue to be empowered to go over the heads of Ukraine to basically give Putin what he wants.
Right. I mean, I hope at least some of that is too gloomy. I think it is interesting that the Canadians have now been invited to the next iteration of the Paris meeting. So that's something, but of course the Canadians face their own electoral issues. Anyway, we should move on to question and answer. For those of you who are in the room, just wave at me and I will give you the floor. For those of you who are online, you can either raise your electronic hand, in which case we will unmute you. Oops, I didn't need to raise my electronic hand. Or you can post your question in the chat and I will read it out. And indeed, I have a first question, which is from Wolfgango Piccoli from Teneo. And I will read that out while the rest of you are thinking about your questions. So I'm not sure which of you would like to answer this, perhaps Iuliia, but the question is, can Ukraine sustain its war efforts if Russia's frozen assets in Europe, worth around 300 billion euros, are seized and used for funding it? Is this feasible in a scenario where the US stops its military and intelligence assistance? So, I mean, I think there may be a question about if the Ukrainians had an extra 300 billion, could they use it effectively on filling some of the military gaps? But also, do you think what do you think the prospects are for being able to get hold of that 300 billion?
Yeah, it's difficult to speculate now. It's always a matter how you effectively use these resources, because one of the statements or arguments coming from the American side is actually to give the full report on how this money that's already been delivered to Ukraine had been used, and it had then been used effectively, and targeted actually at the areas where it had been intended to. In last year, we already started to use this frozen Russian assets in a way, like Ukraine received some money from EU and US in forms of credits, which are actually backed by this Russian frozen assets. I would rather answer probably this question also a bit differently, because it's also important to develop it on how Russian economy is working, because this frozen Russian assets is part of their actual national reserves that also they would be willing to use to support the military campaign in Ukraine. Why? Because as economic data shows, and this is analysis made by Ukrainian Institute for National Economy Development, that Russia's expenditures on military campaign have risen almost twofold, whereas the revenues, especially from the export of energy sources, have been reduced. This is part of the effect of the sanctions, but also National Welfare Fund, which had been used extensively to support this military campaign, had been over 150 billion at the beginning of the war in 2022, and by now it's dropped almost to 40 billion only. So Russians are definitely desperate to use as much money as possible to support the war, and this is why what we are saying to our partners, and I was delighted to hear that the European Commission is not going to lift the sanctions on Russia, regardless what the Americans will be doing. Keep having these sanctions, because cumulative effect is very efficient, and if we not rushing into these negotiations to conclude this deal immediately, but having like 4 months plus, Russians will be facing galloping inflation, which could lead to disastrous results for the economy. So to cut short the answer, yes, I think it would be effectively used, but then a point to consider when it comes to legality and how this process will be ensured with regard to the requirements and the legal conditions that are in existence in the partners' country.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there are some very good lawyers who have come up with ways in which they think this could be done legally. So I think this is not an open and shut case, notwithstanding the views of some particularly German lawyers on the question. Richard, if the Ukrainians had access to 300 billion euros,
great. I mean, it would be brilliant, and they could do an awful lot with it. But I think I go back to my point about using it. You know, some thoughts on how best to apply it. But there's no question it would make a big difference. The other thing, and I should have mentioned it as well, it's not directly related to this, but I think this is a time when, again, Britain should be stepping up to the mark and going back to that Estonian proposal for every European member state of NATO to allocate 0.25% of its GDP for a Ukraine defense fund over 4 years, and that would produce a significant amount as well, and also allow Ukraine to plan over 4 years in a sort of in a strategic sense on how best to apply it.
I can't quite see what sort of amounts of money that would.
So I think it's about 150 billion.
About 150 billion a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's better, better than chump change.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Right. Okay, so I've got one here, and then a couple further back, and then I've got one online. But let's take this one.
Thank you very much, Richard Threlford. I'm the Global Head of Infrastructure, Government and Healthcare at KPMG. And thank you to CER for holding this discussion, and Iuliia and Richard for your comments. Richard, I was hoping you might just build on your observation that you thought effectively the only way forward, given the US stance now, was for Europe and Canada to, I guess, redouble their commitment to Ukraine specifically. But I just wondered, and forgive me because this comes from a sort of ignorance around the sort of way in which NATO works and so on, but what does that imply for sort of governance of security arrangements in Europe? Is it possible to do that effectively, just carrying on, ignoring whatever the US position is in NATO? Does it imply something about further efforts to the creation of a European military establishment that runs alongside NATO? What would the UK's involvement be in that? I just wondered how much could be done just for Ukraine versus how much of that actually implies some far-reaching changes in terms of Europe's own security governance arrangements.
Okay, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think the long-term implications are massive, because if America is effectively withdrawing, it may say that tacitly it will stay a NATO member, but unless that, if America is not prepared to implement Article 5, which is the implication of what we've heard this week, that effectively neutralizes NATO. So there are all sorts of massive governance issues. What is the decision-making role? Because, of course, at the moment, it's the North Atlantic Council, which is based on all the ambassadors of the NATO members, and that requires consensus. And if you have America saying, well, that's it, you don't get consensus, so you can't carry anything through. I don't have any easy answers, except to say that I think this is right now, it's a come-as-you-are party of the coalition of the willing. And not all European members will be prepared to buy into that. So I think we've got to be realistic. It's Ben Wallace's line about the beer drinkers of Northern Europe getting together. But it's about a coalition of the willing to put together what can be done as quickly as possible, together with Canada, to stave off, to give Ukraine the means to achieve as much as they possibly can, and to show real solidarity with Ukraine. But as far as the long-term governance issues you raise, I mean, they're massive, and I can begin to answer them now.
I think that's perhaps rather unkind to the French, who may not be beer drinkers, but actually, in the case of Macron,
very unkind to the French.
Have been working rather harder than some of the Northern Europeans on all of this. Anyway, David Play.
Thank you very much, everyone. Can I just, on the Belgian, on the Euroclear question of seizing the assets, two things. One is the Luxembourg community will not even engage in this. They fear a lawsuit that, if there were an eventual peace in Ukraine, would come back looking for the principal that was seized. And the Belgians won't engage in the conversation either. So this discussion on the 300 billion euros is highly academic, and one shouldn't rely on it. But the question I was going to ask to you, Richard, is the question really of productive capacity in Europe, the arms and armament factories and the industrial capacity to respond. Otherwise, we find ourselves, even if we can fund the gap, which I think we can fund the gap, we find ourselves in a situation where you're back buying all US kit. What is your view about what would be needed, number one? And number two, it is really striking when you look at the data that the Ukrainians are producing drones and howitzers at a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the timeline of pretty much anyone else in the world. So how much of this can you do in Ukraine, with Ukraine as the center of sort of military production in Europe?
Yeah, I think it's a really important, really key point, that. I mean, I think that if in the current circumstances, Europe has an alternative but to go it alone. In terms of productive capacity, it's going to be about, I mean, however far-fetched this sounds, it's about mobilizing economies, putting them on a war footing, letting long-term ammunition contracts build in order to build up stocks. But it's also, and this is where I think the European Union and its partners, and I would like to think that UK is a partner, as is Norway, and the non-European Union members, getting together to do some serious thinking about rationalizing European defense industries. Amalgamations, rationalization. I mean, I'm an old tank commander. To me, it's barking mad. I happen to think that Challenger 2 is probably a bloody good tank. But should we have our own tank industry? I mean, it's a cottage industry. We probably should have just bought Leopard 2, although there are real issues about whether the Germans allow you to use it. I mean, that's another thing altogether. But you know, you can't have 15 different varieties, types of 155mm howitzer produced in Europe with umpteen different marks of ammunition. And we've got to get together. We've got to get to a stage. And this is something I'm sure the European Union could do some good stuff. It is already thinking about how best to rationalize European defense industries so that the default setting is not just to buy off the shelf from Uncle Sam. And the other point here, and it sort of relates to your point about the Ukrainians, is actually the speed and agility with which is needed now, given the pace of advance of technology, puts many of these big American and other prime defense companies at a real disadvantage because they're used to long-term, plan ahead, years away, replace a tank, a howitzer or whatever over 14, 15 years or something. The speed of that is the speed that's needed. It now renders them rather like dinosaurs. And I think we can learn a hell of a lot from Ukraine and build on the experience of organizations like Brave One. And also about harnessing defense, you know, it's about harnessing the sort of technical ingenuity within Europe in the same way that Brave One's harnessed technical ingenuity in Ukraine.
Okay, great. Right, I have Luigi Scazzieri next.
Thank you, and so thank you to the panel for their insights. I wanted to probe Richard's remarks on the state of the Russian army a bit, because you portrayed an army that is in deep crisis, using outdated equipment, running out of equipment. At the same time, what we hear from senior NATO commanders is often that Russia is reconstituting its armed forces very rapidly, that it presents a real and very tangible threat to NATO itself in the short term. In other words, that it's a very worrying military machine. So I just wonder how we can square the circle there in terms of where Russia is. And the second part of the question is on, you know, if we do enter a ceasefire scenario, leaving aside the politics of how desirable or not that might be, would Europeans be able to sustain a significant presence in Ukraine without US enablers and backfill?
Your first point, yeah, Russia is not going to be able to mount an attack on the Baltic states, Romania, anytime soon. But but nevertheless, if Russia is given a break as a result of a Trump brokered deal over the heads of the Ukrainians, which allows which will allow Putin to declare victory and give him time to reconstitute and rebuild and regenerate his military. And that's the worry, because I think that Russia would be able to do that in 2, 3, 5 years' time. I've seen 6 months, but I think one's got to be, you know, they are suffering. They've suffered, I won't repeat it, massive casualties and loss of armored vehicles and all that, and they're scraping the bottom of the barrel. But in time, if they're given a chance, they will absolutely regenerate. And that's the concern, because Putin and the Russians are not going to get rid of that. You know, inbuilt in their DNA is the determination to remove Ukraine from that as a sovereign state. So durable peace without Ukraine membership of NATO, I think not. As for Europe's capacity to maintain in-place forces in Ukraine, let's assume post some sort of ceasefire, I think a real challenge. I mean, we've seen figures bandied about in this country of 10,000 British soldiers. To maintain 10,000 soldiers, well, the first point is that this is, even if there's a peace to keep, it's not going to be a peace that's going to be kept by blue-buried traditional UN peacekeepers. Not a chance. They just be brushed out of the way. This is going to require a seriously capable military force that is prepared to overface and overmatch the Russians if the Russians tried it on. I mean, there are huge questions, of course, and Lavrov has already said that no Europeans would be acceptable, but let's just, move that to a side. I don't think, and then, so you're going to need all the paraphernalia of 21st century conflict with long-range precision missiles, with tanks, armored infantry, all the combined arms stuff, all the drones, air power, the lot. Can Europe generate that? It might be able to do something like that for a short time, but you're talking about 1,000 kilometers, 1,200 kilometers of front line. The NATO implementation force in Bosnia, which implemented the Dayton Agreement in 95, 96, was 90,000. Bosnia-Herzegovina, a pocket-sized country. And, we weren't facing anything like the sort of military threat that even now, despite its challenges, Russia could pose. I think you're going to need a minimum of 200,000, maybe more. Britain talks about, we've heard talk about 10,000. To maintain 10,000 would require 30,000. The army is 70,000 because you've got to have 10,000 in place, 10,000 waiting to go, 10,000 recovering, coming back, and being retrained, etc., etc. I don't think the British could do that without mobilizing all the reserves and quite possibly, as I said, well, the Daily Mail have made much of it today, saying, thinking quite hard about conscription. And then you've got the NATO nations. Germany have already shown that they're pretty wobbly about the notion. Other countries have said no. So that leaves, we know Britain and France have said yes. I mean, I think it's such a massive ask, and it's only going to be doable if there's a major increase in defense spending and a complete mobilization of society in a way which we haven't begun to think about yet.
Okay. Right. Let me take a couple of questions together because we've got quite a few now. So I'll take Robert Brinkley, who's online, and then Anna Reid. So if somebody can unmute Robert. There. Robert, I think we should be able to hear you.
Ian, hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Robert Brinkley. I was British ambassador in Ukraine in the dim and distant past. I find myself, Ian, very much in your position of someone who has spent a career being an Atlanticist, now feeling angry and grieved. I agree very much with the speakers and General Shirreff's depiction of what Trump is up to. We see an American president who is acting in the interests of Russia, of our major enemy. This is deeply alarming and makes me wonder whether Trump is in fact a Russian agent of influence. Now, I don't have evidence to prove that one way or another, but there was quite a lot of research done into that during his first term as president. Nevertheless, judging by what he is actually doing, the way he is serving Russian interests, I think now the UK and Europe and Canada really have to look to our own national security interests. And this is going to be particularly difficult for the UK because our defence and intelligence is so closely intertwined with that of the United States. So these are dark days and very difficult times ahead. I don't know whether your speakers wish to comment on that. And probably this theory about an agent of influence is unprovable at the moment, but I think we have to proceed by the actions that we see.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. At least I don't think any of us is likely to be able to lay our hands on the proof. But in a sense, it doesn't make that much difference. It doesn't, whether Trump is a recruited agent of influence or just somebody who happens to believe this stuff. He's doing the same amount of damage. Anyway, I don't know whether you want to comment on, Trump and his peculiar. I mean, it's not just that Trump has this strange relationship with Putin, but I mean, he also has this strange hostility to Ukraine, which came through in the press conference yesterday. And I don't know whether you have any insight into, what is it that the Ukrainians have done that has offended Trump so much?
There have been a number of different versions about what might be behind this. If you remember, there had been a case on his former advisor Manafort, I guess, somehow linked to Ukrainian political leadership back to the Yanukovych times, and that's the way Ukrainian handled that case afterwards, especially Poroshenko. So I think that this might something that could be there. However, when Trump was still considered as a potential candidate for presidency, we had been told a different view from Americans, that Trump is definitely gonna like and he respects Zelensky, because he didn't supported Biden, or he didn't agree to Biden's pressure to actually reveal some of the Trump's ideas when it comes to Ukraine's file, what he'd been doing. So we had been expecting this kind of sort of like at least respect, and not very much rushing of Trump very swiftly moving into this pro-Russian defending case. This is something that me as a diplomat, as negotiator, always wanted to refrain from. So a lot of Ukrainian political experts have been saying already that this is disaster. We are just heading speedily to this trap, to this gap. I was trying to put myself on a reserve mode by saying, look, let's judge by actions and so on. But yesterday, I was actually questioning myself and saying that it's probably right time to admit that he is actually really repeating Russian narratives. Let me give you a couple of stuff that actually caused my concern yesterday. So when Trump is saying that Russians could have destroyed the whole Ukraine if they would have wished to, because they have this capacity, it means that he's not questioning Russian might, regardless that Russians failed militarily in Ukraine for 3 years. And it's definitely something which is felt like a result of these Riyadh talks between Russians and the American teams. The advisors of Trump definitely reported on that. And this is one of the indications. Second one, a reference to that Ukraine is not, we're not heading for peace, we're not obtaining peace. It would have done so. They had these opportunities for the last 3 years. Again, this is a marker that he doesn't understand entirely the whole nature of the war, and where we are and why we had not been able to get a negotiated solution with Russia. But also it is the reference to this Istanbul agreement. We know perfectly well what was the content of this agreement. Again, this is something that Russians definitely, their narrative by saying we were always into this kind of trying to seek peace in peaceful terms, not acting militarily. And you see, it's Ukrainians who always wanted war and the Europeans who wanted war. So basically, I think, yes, right now, even the most conservative experts like I attribute myself to questioning actually this kind of stuff. And if somebody would be able to provide with this kind of data on Trump's playing potential role of this agent of influence of Russia, I would be delighted to see it, because knowing Russian mentality and mindset, I definitely knew confidence that back then, to the times of Cold War and Iron Curtain and Trump's presence in Moscow in the 80s, definitely Russians had been doing a lot of compromise and setting up all these traps to get this dirty stuff to blackmail him later on. This they are doing to any person, so he was not the exception, definitely. This is why I do think that if somebody is able to dig into that issue and actually to save the world from this angle of actions, I think it would be a good option.
Did you want to pick up the point about the UK's entanglement with the US in defence and intelligence? Because I think this is it's an interesting point, the extent to which we ourselves are so embedded within US structures that it's really quite difficult for us to go it alone.
It's going to take a lot of untangling. I'll leave others to comment on the intelligence side, but the military side, we are. I mean, in fact, my son-in-law is the chief plans for Headquarters 3, which sits at the moment, who's sitting in what used to be called Fort Hood in Texas on a major exercise, and they are, they would be part of an American corps. So this is going to take time. But on the other hand, the military are pretty flexible about regrouping, and anything is possible. I mean, just a point picking up. And I think what Robert Brinkley said is really, really powerful about dark days ahead and the disappointment that we all feel as long-term transatlanticists. I remember I listened to one of a podcast which Leon Panetta was talking on the other day. He was talking to Richard Dearlove, and these are two spy masters getting together. And he said you need to think about the relationship between Trump and Putin as the relationship between a spy master and his contact, which I thought was an interesting insight.
Yes. Okay, so let's see, I got Anna Reid next.
I have two questions. One follows on from what we've been talking about. First of all, we've been talking more about the long term and the need for European sort of disengagement from American rearmament, but just talking about this coming summer and next winter, suppose Trump comes to a deal with Putin and promises Putin that he won't sell Europe, he won't sell Ukraine any more arms, and they won't be passed on to Ukraine. How big a hole would that leave Ukraine in? I mean, how big are their stockpiles at the moment, and where would the holes be? What could Europe not provide if America stops passing arms to Ukraine immediately? I mean, we're talking the next couple of months or whatever.
Okay. Do you want to take that?
Well, I to be honest, I can't give you the real detail because I simply don't have the visibility of what Ukraine's got, what stockpiles, etc. But I think it's I would start by saying the sort of long-range precision missiles, the ATACMS, which are, these are not, they're not mass-produced. They're really expensive. And if America stops the supply of that, then Britain will be stuck because, missiles that we've got, we buy from the Americans. So you can just see there's a sort of linking of the chain here. So I think the simple answer is a massive hub. I can't say more than that.
And what levers can we use immediately on Trump to stop him doing that, to stop him throwing Ukraine entirely under the bus? I mean, we've got to the point where the sort of usual things, a bit of conciliation, a bit of flattery, carrot of a royal visit, all the stuff of sort of conventional diplomacy, that seems to it seems to be that we're going to have to put that aside and we have to play him at his own game. And where are the levers? I mean, everybody in this room, I'm sure, has views on that.
Yeah.
If I may just offer one point, $56 billion has gone into American defense industries as a result of the aid that America has given to Ukraine, because pretty well all of it has been spent in American factories, many of whom are Trump voting parts of the world. So this is going to hurt the American economy as well.
Yeah. do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just briefly on potential leverage, because we also have been thinking about that, and definitely, I think the problem is that Trump is currently considering that he can achieve everything in this world without Europeans. So definitely, but there are definitely some areas, and some of them we probably not may be able to talk publicly on, where US, where Europeans partnership or alliances with America is indispensable. And let's consider from the point of China angle here. So how America could withstand this competition with China if they don't have Europeans on board. And this is something that could be looked at. Probably some more pragmatic stuff like buying American LPG gas or something like that. So I think that this type of question needs creative thinking on the level of Europeans collectively. And what I actually, where I see a positive sign of, it's about this questionnaire that Americans gave to Europeans just before the Munich Security Conference, with concise questions like what you are able to contribute with to support Ukraine, to keep this position of strength in negotiations, and what leverages, economic leverages in terms of sanctions you're ready to apply on top to keep Russia, and what kind of US assistance you would need to be able to ensure that. So to my mind, these are quite concrete questions, and as soon as Europeans are ready to come up with coherent answer with concise data, concise figures, and I think that this is one of the reasons of this Paris summit, second chain Paris summit that Macron called for. So there is this marker for me of Americans wanted to talk constructively with Europeans. So it's not a complete denial. And this is why we still, I leave this room for optimism, have to look at actions actually, because this honeymoon of Putin and Trump might end very soon.
It's about doing, not talking. It's about saying, right, we are going to increase, there's a clear statement in this country and in other European countries. We're going to move now to 3%, and we're going to put together of defense spending, and we're going to put together a strategy that demonstrates how we can do it as quickly as possible. And I go back to my point about a clear statement from a united Europe that we are going to support Ukraine, and this is how we're going to do it. I think talking and supplicating and all that is a waste of time. You've just got to demonstrate that you're prepared to get stuck in and do stuff, and quickly. Action this day.
Okay. Right. Speaking of which, we need to move ahead swiftly. We've got a number of questions, and I see one more. Okay. So let me take questions. Actually, I think I'll have to take questions 3 at a time. So first, I've got Anna Caprile, who is online. If somebody can unmute Anna, then it will be Ben Hall and then David Hannock. So Anna, can you speak?
Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Anna Caprile and I work for the European Parliament Research Service. Thank you very much for this interesting debate. My question was regarding which role is playing the rare earth metals deal that was offered by Trump. Apparently, it was suggested by Zelensky first, but not in that terms, of course, then redrafted by the Trump's team and finally rejected by Zelensky. Somebody has qualified this deal as the first time an aggressed country has been presented a bill of reparation. So it was obviously drafted to be rejected, and is now this part of the table in the US-Russia negotiations, because most of the rare earths are actually in the occupied territories. And when, according to the composition of the Russian delegation in Saudi Arabia, one very prominent Russian businessman was there. His name is
Kirill Dmitriev.
yes, Kirill Dmitriev. Thank you. and I mean, I take the expression that is one spy master talking to his contact, but wouldn't be also true that these two businessmen talking to each other? Are we just talking about business here? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Ben Hall.
Thanks very much, Ben Hall from the FT. A question for Iuliia first of all, and then one for Richard. I think Ukraine's biggest military problem right now is not arms or ammunition, it's manpower. And so I was wondering whether you could just comment on the prospects for Ukraine to continue to mobilize sufficient quantities of men and to train them in the context of a US abandonment, essentially. And then a question for Richard comes back on the Robert Brinkley question, which is the difficulty of defying Trump over Ukraine and the Europeans coming up with an alternative solution in defiance of what Trump wants, when Trump can still dangle the American security umbrella, crumbling though it may be, in front of them, and threaten them that if you don't back my Ukraine deal, I will just pull out of NATO altogether. And that is surely going to be a fantastic piece of leverage with the countries that are the strongest supporters of Ukraine: Britain, Poland, the Baltic states, and the Nordics, and the Germans.
Okay. David Hanna, and then I'll give the two of you a chance to answer that.
David Hanna, I was ambassador to the UN and to the European communities for 10 years altogether, and I agree with the General's view that it's not UN peacekeeping that we're talking about in any sense here. It couldn't work in those circumstances. I too was a tank commander. I had 3 Centurions about 10 miles from the Elbe in 1955, and the 4th tank in my troop was unusable because it was always being cannibalized to keep the other 3 on the road. So it shows it's not the only first time we've had these problems. But I wonder if you could answer one question, which is, has any comparison been made between the rearmament that took place at the time of the Korean War and which led on to a firming up of deterrence and effective, successful deterrence for many decades after it? How does that compare? I know, of course, that most of it would have been done by the Americans. The second question I'd like to ask is, shouldn't the totality of Europeans be bringing into play the issue of sanctions? It seems to be being assumed by the Americans that if a deal is struck, even a very bad deal for Ukraine, the sanctions will all be lifted. That would be pretty silly, of course, because it would enable exports to Russia to help them rearm, and it would presumably also allow exports of Russian gas and oil. If the totality of Europe, which is far more important in terms of sanctions than the United States-Russian trade is piffling. It's not very big. And so, and the Americans aren't going to be importing Russian gas or oil, that's for sure. If it became clear that a bad deal was going to leave Russia under sanctions from the majority of the world, which could include Japan, South Korea, and other countries, which are worried about the knock-on effects with China, wouldn't that be something that might make the Americans pause for thought?
Okay. Who wants to kick off? Do you want to?
Yeah, on this rare metal or critical minerals deal. So definitely, initially when the idea came and was introduced to American side, both sides actually said that it was very good, very smart, pragmatic move from Ukrainian side, and this is something that kept Trump interest. But then the first draft of this agreement came, and immediately on that day, the media reported that Zelensky rejected the draft. And to me, as a diplomat, it was obvious, if it had not been something that had been negotiated between the both sides, it's not a draft, it's not an agreement, it's ultimatum, actually, take it or leave it. Right now, our Vice Prime Minister said that the deal, the agreement will be signed, but what will be inside? So currently, I guess the countries are trying to negotiate, or at least Ukrainian side is trying to negotiate at least something like that. On terms of looking at this as potential part of what Russians might be promising Americans in their bilateral track, because part of these minerals are in possession of the Russian-controlled territories right now. From the point of negotiation, this is really smart move, and if put it bluntly, if I were Russians, I would be doing this. But then the question comes, how legally, in terms of international law, it could be justified if something is agreed between America and Russia on the territories which actually legally completely belong to Ukraine. And then it actually evokes another question, whether we could also say it's at the end of transatlantic partnership, but it's also at the end of international law. In the light of the recent sanctions of America on International Criminal Court, I think that it's also a very big gift to Putin to reconsider the perspective of him being charged as a war criminal for abducting Ukrainian children. So I think that yeah, we only at this moment we only can highlight and point these risks. I'm not, probably not the only one who can't, who is not able to provide you with a clear answer to that. But this is something that should be definitely kept on. And prospects on manpower. Can I answer both questions, or should I leave?
Yeah, sure. Why don't you take that one quickly, and then I'll pass over to Richard.
Yeah. So prospects on manpower. So definitely this issue has been defined by Ukrainian population as one of the critical problems. The first comes corruption, and then it comes the issue of mobilization. And I think that a couple of factors contributed to that. First is that Ukrainian government always tried to keep this face that we are capable and just about to win this war militarily. And that means that a lot of people just thought, even male, who are pacifists in their hearts, they don't want to fight, don't want to get killed. They thought, why should I now go there, because the war might be over in 1 month's time, and so on. So this was partially the reason why this total defense phenomenon that we observed at the beginning has been fading. And second, it's that Russians are very effectively playing in information war now, in information war. If at the beginning of war, Ukrainians were very good at countering all this propaganda, fake news, and whatever, right now Russians are very, very effectively playing with these kind of sensitive issues inside society, creating this kind of fake stories or exaggerating stories of mishandling the potential conscripts and so on. So I think, yes, to answer your question, the problem is there, but let me still refer to something that we had been advocating for the end of 2023. Provided Ukraine got access to all the technologies and advanced technologies that we were wanting from our partners to work, we could counterbalance this. It's not symmetrical war with equal manpower fight. Ukraine could beat the enemy with supremacy in technology, with technology, and this is something that we also haven't received from our partners yet to the desired extent.
Okay. The role played by rare earths, the rare earth metal deal. My understanding is that not only are many of the rare earths in occupied Ukraine, but they're also still, most of it's still in the ground. So you've got to go through a process of mining it, and that plays into the whole issue of Ukraine recovery. But I think the overriding sort of message, I think it came that left, or impression it left, was of the utter ruthless avariciousness of Trump and America. I mean, talk about kicking a man when he's down, and a mate when and a friend when they're down and on their uppers. I mean, it's just beyond belief, and it just leaves the most vile taste in the mouth that Trump, the elected president of the United States, should do that. But that's the nature of the man. Leverage of American security for Europe. I think we're on a different era now. Last week was the era of Atlantic integration. I think it's said again and again, the Pax Americana is finished, and we now need to get used to that, and we've got to find ways of doing it. And that's why I think we just have to, as I say, if that's what you want to do, America, fine. You want us to rely on ourselves, fine. That's the end of it. Now, it's easy to say that, but I think the reality is, I think historians will date Munich 2025 as the day the Americans finally left the stage, as far as European security is concerned, and the day that Europeans woke up to the reality that they're on their own, and that the only way that we can guarantee European security is, together with Canada, is effectively together, and all the reasons we've talked about. Interesting that so your point about the Korean post-Korean War, and I spotted I read about the Times leader mentions it today. I mean, the difference, of course, the challenges that government faces in a world where social welfare payments and the National Health Service consumes such a vast chunk of the national wealth, all highlights to the points about the need for some hard strategic thinking about how you can do it. But equally, there are real lessons to be learned, I think, from right throughout the Cold War about mobilizing capability on behalf of the nation's security. And that's a good example. And as far as sanctions and Europe is concerned, I think it's a great idea, a great plan, but it absolutely, of course, depends on sanctions being effective, about ensuring that they're properly tight, and that the means of evading them are minimized as much as possible. But I think that's absolutely something that should be thought through.
Great. Okay, we have 6 people with questions and 9 minutes. So this is going to be quick questions and quick answers, and I'll take questions in groups of 3. So can somebody unmute Mary Dejewski? There, right, Mary, go ahead.
Hello, I was actually expecting to have it read out for me, but let me just go back to it. I was asking whether it was really worth putting the whole of Europe on a war footing for the sake of what amounts to 20% or so of Ukraine's territory being restored, and having Ukraine in NATO, which could also be seen as a risk in itself.
Okay, very good. Then the next question was from Janet Gunn. If somebody can unmute Janet. There,
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree with all those who have said so far that we must stop just talking and get our act together, and fast. And various suggestions have come up in recent days, such as establishing a bank similar to the way the EBRD was established at the end of the Cold War, to help to fund the rearmament of Europe. Because it has struck me, I'm also watching what's going on in the US, as well as what's happening in US foreign policy. And the rule of Musk seems to have taken over from the rule of law there, which must have some implications for existing and potential investors. Might a rearming Europe be a more attractive prospect for investors?
Okay, good question. And then there was a hand at the back. I can't see who it belongs to. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is David Bentham. I'm an advisor to John Healey, our Defence Secretary. Forgive the directness of the question. I feel Trump is actually a really convenient excuse. We've known for years that Ukraine needs more help. We've known for decades we're dependent on the US. And we've known since at least Trump's last term, if not before, his views on NATO and that potential direction. So should we be as surprised as we are? Who has actually failed us within our institutions in Europe and the UK, and which voices should be taking a bit of a back seat in the next year or so? Thank you.
Okay, interesting questions. All right, let's take that little group of three then. So that's, is it worth putting Europe on a war footing for 20% of Ukraine and the chance of Ukraine joining NATO? Would an EBRD for defence be a good idea? And who should be taking a back seat because of the things that they shouldn't have been taken by surprise by, but were?
I think all of these questions is probably would be good to listen the answer from a European representative of Europe rather than Ukraine lecturing you why it's important for you to fight for this 20% of Ukraine's territory and part of Ukraine being in NATO. If these questions are still arising from the audience, so I'm actually speechless.
Okay, do you want to
Yes.
pick up some of those?
Is it worth putting Europe on a war footing? I think we've got to understand what Russia's about. Once Russia's achieved its aim in Ukraine, which it looks as if Trump is going to help Russia do, Russia will move on, no question about it. It'll move on. It's already started in Moldova, Georgia, and of course, Romania. And if it sees NATO neutralized, if it sees the Europeans still in disarray, still disunited, I've no doubt that Putin will have a go at the Baltic states, or some successor to Putin have a go at the Baltic states. And that means very likely that we end up fighting Russia. And that is a consideration too ghastly to contemplate, except to find ways of preventing it. And the only way we're going to maintain peace in the transatlantic region, I think, for generations to come, and unless and until Russia somehow goes through a major metamorphosis and gets the notion of building empires out of its DNA, which has been there since Russia started as a state. The only way is through effective deterrence of Russia. So this isn't about, this is about our security. And the bottom line is that our security doesn't start on the White Cliffs of Dover or the Murray Firth. It starts in Eastern Europe. It starts on the frontiers of Ukraine. It starts on the front line of Ukraine. It starts in the forests of Lithuania, of Estonia, of Latvia, and it starts in Eastern Poland. We are absolutely united together on that score. And so, yes, I think it is absolutely worth putting Europe on a war footing to achieve our long-term peace and security. And unless we're prepared to do that, I hold no hopes for our long-term peace and security.
Okay,
and one of the ways,
very quick.
Yeah, okay, rearmament bank, great idea. I think explore, leave no stone unturned at all. And who should be keeping a back seat? And I don't say this in a party political sense, but an awful lot of Tory politicians should be keeping a back seat, because what's happened under 14 years of Tory government is the effective dismemberment of our armed forces.
Okay, you wanted to add a
comment? Yeah, just a very small comment, because of listening to these discussions and brilliant answers of Richard. I can't help mentioning that one of Ukrainian experts said that basically, given what we saw in Munich, Trump has effectively liberated Ukraine from geopolitical loneliness, meaning that Europe now really has to think seriously about what should be done by Europe, because we feel, especially in light of these questions of why we should fight for 20% of Ukraine's territory, we feel ourselves like Cassandras. So it's Cassandra course. We've been talking about this since 2014. And finally, now after Munich, after all these speeches of Americans, Europeans have realized that it is getting serious and we need to do something.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let me see. I have three last questions, which starts with Craig Oliphant, who's online. So if somebody can unmute Craig. Okay, nice and brief. And then I've got Martin Sandbu and Charles Grant will be the last question. So Craig first, then Martin, then Charles.
Yep, thanks, Ian. Thanks, Ian, and deep appreciation to Iuliia and Richard for their insights. I would also just really want to echo what Robert Brinkley said earlier. My question is really, any thoughts on the risks of US pulling the lever, withdrawing Starlink satellite cover to Ukraine, given the importance of that for Ukrainian drone warfare? Thank you.
Okay. Martin Sandbu, also online. Somebody can unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thanks very much. It's a very narrow follow-up to the question on the specifics of what weapons capabilities Europe might need to supply that Richard mostly addressed, but it's for both of you. Whatever happened to the Taurus debate, and to what extent would a German change of heart after a change of government make any difference?
Okay. And finally, Charles.
An observation rather than a question. I think the root of the problem is different conceptions of international order. We liberals assume that everybody in the West supported territorial integrity, protection of weak against the strong, international rule of law. That's not how it is to Xi, Putin or Trump. They believe in spheres of influence. Might is right. And we've seen this with Trump wanting Greenland, Panama and Canada because it's in his sphere of influence. According to that logic, Ukraine belongs to Russia. This is the trouble. And it's not just a geographical split between Europe and America on this. I'm afraid America is pretty much 50-50 on this, and Europe is split too. There's a whole swathe of countries in former Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria, Slovakia, soon the Czech Republic, Romania, Slovenia, Croatia, Hungary, which have a similar view to Xi, Putin and Trump on this, I'm afraid. It's not going to go away. So it's just a gloomy observation for me. But on the Taurus, I think Friedrich Merz has said that he supports supplying Taurus. He may be chancellor soon. He also supports sending peacekeepers to Ukraine. So maybe the Germans will help us a little bit.
Maybe the Germans will help us. Right. Okay, that's not the most cheerful thought that we could have ended on. But anyway, yes, do you want to try and take Craig and Martin's questions and then any final observations in response to Charles?
The risks of the US pulling Starlink, absolutely. I mean, it's part of an overall, the complete golf bag of American support to Ukraine. And this. I go back to my point about strategy to replace it. So this is where Europe's got to sit down, do a gap analysis. What are the Americans supplying? What are the critical capabilities? And what do we need to do to replace them? And how quickly can we do it? And similarly, Taurus, absolutely. And that comes under the heading of action now in order to help Ukraine. It's part of the overall what needs to be done to support Ukraine, give the Russians a real bloody nose.
Yeah. I mean, just on Starlink, is there a European counterpart?
I don't know.
Okay. Right. Because I thought that the UK was investing in low Earth satellites, but
okay, I can't help you there.
Okay. Iuliia.
Yeah, I don't know on this military technical stuff, but I'm definitely sure that Ukrainians are already thinking about the contingency plans on if Starlink is removed from that. Just comment on what Charles said very briefly. So yes, I think that these are very right gloomy observations, and I think that sometimes I do think that for Trump, who claims Greenland is our territory, Canada should be 51st state, and Panama Channel should be renamed in American Channel. I always think, what then differs that from Putin claiming that Ukraine is our territory for some reasons, and this our, and so the risk is that these two men, Trump much more easier understand and faster will understand Putin and his point of view, rather than Ukraine's and Europe's claiming what is right to be according to international law.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's been an extremely rich discussion, not always the most cheerful.
Yeah.
I think there are things that we can do. I agree, action this day is a good thing to have, you know, not just on a plate on your desk, but in your mind and delivered every day. I think that if I take away one thing, it is whatever happens in Riyadh or anywhere else, Ukraine will keep fighting because Ukraine wants to continue to exist. And for Europeans, it will become an increasingly existential question as well, whether we support you or not. But anyway, I hope you will all join me in thanking our two excellent panelists Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who's been listening online. We were on the record. I'm sure we said some indiscreet things, which will no doubt come back to haunt us, but there we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.